rain never stopped. It came in waves that blurred the horizon, soaking the world until sky and earth seemed to dissolve into one gray breath. Imagine waking up to that, day after day, your fire hissing under the weight of endless water, your clothes heavy as clay, the smell of wet wood clinging to everything you own. Modern man, wrapped in plastic shells and synthetic comfort, would call it misery. But for the indigenous peoples of North America, this was not misfortune. It was simply weather, a teacher, not an enemy. Here's the catch. They didn't stay dry because they fought the rain. They stayed dry because they learned to think like it. When storms rolled across the plains or mist soaked the forests for days, they already knew what to do. Their secret wasn't magic or luck. It was knowledge, deep, material, patient knowledge built through centuries of observation. Every fiber, every stitch, every pole in their shelters had a purpose. Each part worked with nature, not against it. Picture the Great Plains in late autumn, a horizon that never ends, wind cutting through the grass like invisible knives, and rain that doesn't fall, it drives. The people who lived here, the Lakota, the Cheyenne, the Blackfoot, built homes that looked fragile to outsiders, thin walls of hide stretched over poles. Yet those simple forms outlasted blizzards and hurricanes. Their tipis didn't collapse under the storm's rage. They shed it, like a leaf sheds rain. While European settlers huddled in leaky cabins of heavy wood, native families sat around warm fires inside elegant cones of skin, perfectly dry. Weird part? There was no waterproof fabric, no tarp, no canvas, no waxed coating, just hides, smoke, sinew, and design, but used with a precision that would make an engineer nod in awe. It wasn't brute strength that kept them safe. It was understanding the behavior of water, air, and heat. In the eastern woodlands, the Iroquois, Huron, and other nations faced a different kind of challenge. Not open storms, but an endless mist, drizzle, and damp that crept into every crack. Their answer wasn't to build higher or thicker walls. It was to think like trees. Their longhouses, covered in overlapping sheets of elm bark, acted like a living forest, each piece shedding water onto the next, each seam tightening under rain. The roofs curved just enough to let the flow run fast, while vents above the hearth breathed smoke through rain without letting it in. Theirs was architecture, grown from the logic of nature itself. It makes you wonder, how did they know? How did people without chemistry, degrees, or meteorological charts read the sky, the bark, and the hide so accurately? The secret lay in centuries of experiment, quiet trial and error carried by memory, not written on paper, but passed from voice to voice, from hands that scraped hides to hands that stitched sinew. Here's the smart move. They never aimed for perfect dryness. That idea, that humans must keep water out entirely, is modern. For them, the goal was balance. Let the rain fall. Let the fabric breathe. Let the skin dry fast. They understood what scientists today call thermoregulation. That staying too dry could mean trapping sweat, chilling the body from within. So their clothes and shelters worked on a deeper logic. Moisture could come and go freely, and warmth would survive the process. A fire still burned in the storm's heart. Deep in each teepee or longhouse, the flames didn't drown, they thrived. Smoke, guided by flaps and vents, spiraled upward and out, carrying steam and dampness away. Outside, rain hissed on the hides. Inside, the air stayed dry and alive. It wasn't comfort by modern standards. It was harmony, a balance between breath, heat, and sky. And beneath it all ran a philosophy older than any textbook. The earth is not against you. The storm is not your foe. Resist, and you lose. Cooperate, and you endure. That quiet wisdom shaped every detail, from smoked buckskin that dried like living skin to roofs that sealed themselves tighter with every drop. In this world of perpetual wetness, survival was not about invention. It was about remembering. The land taught, and people listened. When the clouds broke for a moment and a shaft of light fell through, the hides glowed amber, the air thick with the scent of smoke and rain. A calm so deep it made you forget that outside, the storm was still raging. The real story of how Native Americans stayed dry isn't about ancient tricks or forgotten materials. It's about design that breathes, knowledge built from cooperation with every natural force. Because when you live close enough to the land, you stop asking how to escape the rain. You learn how to live inside it. That's where the genius begins, in the quiet understanding that survival is not resistance, but rhythm. A rhythm shaped by smoke, hide, bark, and the eternal song of rain. The first drops fall like a whisper, soft but certain. A storm is coming. For most of us, that sound means retreat. Grab a jacket, close the windows, find shelter. But for the indigenous peoples of North America, it was a cue to act in rhythm with the elements. They didn't run from the storm. They adjusted to it, as effortlessly as a bird folds its wings before a gust. Here's the insight. Their survival wasn't luck or superstition. It was engineering, disguised as tradition, wrapped in story. Every tool and every structure they built contained the same logic we now call climate science. The Tipi, for instance, wasn't just a tent. It was a microclimate, a self-regulating system that balanced temperature, airflow, and humidity without a single nail or metal hinge. At first glance, its design looks simple, a cone of hides over poles. But look deeper, and the details come alive. The slope of its walls was no accident. Too steep, and the rain would hammer the surface until it tore. Too shallow, and water would pool and seep through. Generations of trial tuned that angle to perfection. Steep enough for rain to roll off instantly, yet shaped so wind could glide over it without resistance. The result? The teepee didn't fight the storm. It let the storm pass through. Here's the weird part. Even the seams were alive. The hides were stitched with sinew, the tough connective fiber from animals. When dry, it was tight. But when wet, sinew swelled, sealing its own holes. A natural, self-healing seam. The heavier the rain, the tighter the stitches pulled together. Nature's own waterproofing, designed without a single chemical or factory. Inside, the story deepens. A tipis liner, the inner wall called the ozone, acted like the invisible layer of the atmosphere. Most people never realized it existed, yet it controlled everything. The ozone didn't reach the ground or the top. It floated halfway, creating a curtain of moving air. When the fire burned, hot air rose, pulling cold, damp air up through that hidden channel and out through the smoke flaps. The result was balance. Heat circulated, moisture escaped, and no condensation formed on the inner walls. In modern terms, that's controlled convection and thermal insulation, built from nothing more than hide, air, and gravity. If you could step inside during a storm, you'd notice something uncanny. The sound of rain softened to a murmur. The air was warm but dry. Drops that managed to leak through the outer skin rolled down the ozone and disappeared between the two layers, draining harmlessly outside. You'd feel protected not by walls, but by design. This wasn't isolated genius. Across regions, different tribes arrived at similar principles, local adaptations to the same natural laws. The Iroquois longhouse in the wet forests of the Northeast followed the same philosophy through different materials. Layers of bark, not hides. Each sheet overlapping the next like feathers, angled just enough to use gravity as an ally. Resin-filled gaps, flexible enough to move with wind but tight enough to resist water. Above the hearth, vents could be adjusted with poles, open wide for smoke, narrow for rain. If you've ever seen a modern ridge vent on a house roof, you've witnessed the echo of this ancient idea. Here's the smart move. None of this was about isolation. It was about connection. Fire, air, and water weren't separate problems to solve. They were parts of one living system. Indigenous builders understood that comfort didn't come from sealing yourself away from nature, but from working with its flow. Even the placement of a teepee or longhouse was calculated with precision. Doors faced east, away from prevailing storms, catching the morning sun. Camps were built on slight rises to drain water naturally. Fires burned in the center, where rising heat met descending cool air, maintaining a perfect draft. Science today would call this integrated design, but they called it common sense, taught through stories, practiced through living. To a modern engineer, these systems could be mapped with arrows and data. To them, it was simply knowing the breadth of the land. And it wasn't just shelter. The same insight shaped how they dressed, stored food, and carried fire. Brain-tanned buckskin, that soft, smoky leather, wasn't waterproof in the way we think of plastic. It was hydrophobic through structure, not coating. The smoke infused it with aldehydes that stabilized its fibers, making it resistant to stiffening and shrinking. When wet, it stretched. When dry, it returned. Like skin, it breathed, moved, and healed. You could drench it in rain, hang it by a fire, and within minutes, it would be supple again. This is the real aha moment. Indigenous materials weren't primitive. They were performance materials, not because they mimicked modern synthetics, but because they preceded them. They achieved what we still strive for: adaptability, breathability, regeneration, using nothing but natural chemistry. You might say they invented sustainable design before we even had a word for it. Every shelter, every garment, every tool reflected a worldview that the environment wasn't a threat to escape, but a partner to understand. So when the rain came, endless, cold, merciless, they didn't brace against it. They moved with it, the way grass bends under the wind and stands again. And somewhere between the smoke of the fire and the rhythm of falling water, they found comfort. Not the comfort of walls and insulation, but the comfort of belonging to a world where survival was not resistance, but cooperation. That understanding, the physics of balance hidden inside what looked like simplicity, was their greatest innovation. It wasn't just about staying dry. It was about staying in tune. When the rain turned relentless and the ground turned to mirrors, every object in a native camp became part of a system, a toolkit for living within the storm. Each tool, each material, and each process carried the same underlying wisdom. Nothing resists nature. Everything cooperates with it. Here's the insight that modern survivalists often miss. Staying dry wasn't a single invention. It was a network of small, brilliant designs that together created resilience. Some were invisible, like the chemical transformation of smoked leather. Others stood tall, like the Tipi's frame angled perfectly against the sky. Each solved one part of the same puzzle: how to live where rain was constant, fire fragile, and warmth fleeting. Let's start with what touched the skin first: the clothing. The secret material wasn't cloth, but smoked, brain-tanned buckskin. To make it, hides from deer, elk, or bison were first scraped clean and soaked in an emulsion made from the animal's own brain mixed with water. The fats in this mixture, lecithins and natural oils, bonded with the fibers of the hide, loosening and lubricating them. The result was a material astonishingly soft, flexible, and breathable. But there was a catch. When this raw, brain-tanned leather dried after getting wet, it could stiffen like cardboard. That's where smoke, the final, decisive step, came in. The hides were stretched over frames and hung above smoldering fires fueled by specific woods, often punky cottonwood, willow, or rotten alder. The smoke wasn't just for color. It carried aldehydes and resins that chemically cross-linked the collagen in the hide. In modern terms, it polymerized the material naturally, locking its structure in place. The result? Leather that never stiffened, no matter how many times it was soaked and dried. It became what we might call breathing armor, resistant to water, quick to dry, and astonishingly durable. Here's the smart move. Instead of sealing moisture out, this leather allowed moisture to move through, drying faster by body heat or fire warmth. Shirts, leggings, and moccasins made from it didn't trap sweat, which could chill a body faster than rain. In the physics of comfort, ventilation was as valuable as insulation. This is why indigenous clothing worked not by repelling water, but by balancing it. Now, step inside the Tepee, the center of home and warmth. Every part of this structure was a tool in itself. The long poles, usually made of lodgepole pine, were chosen not just for straightness, but for flexibility. A teepee had between 12 and 20 poles arranged in a tripod or quadrupod formation. Their angle wasn't random. It followed a geometric principle of tension and compression. The upper ends crossed to create a stable apex, while the lower circle flared wide enough to resist wind pressure, yet narrow enough to keep heat concentrated. The covering, made from bison hides or later from canvas, wrapped in a single spiral. It overlapped precisely so that rain sliding down one panel fell harmlessly over the next. The seams, stitched with sinew, swelled when wet, creating self-sealing channels. At the top, 2 smoke flaps could be adjusted with poles from the ground, acting like movable lungs. Point them one way, and they drew fresh air in. Point them the other, and they carried smoke and steam out. A teepee could be fine-tuned in real time, responding to wind direction and rainfall like a breathing organism. The floor wasn't neglected either. It was never bare earth. Layers of dry grass, cattail mats, and animal hides created a natural insulation barrier, keeping moisture from creeping upward. Around the central hearth, stones absorbed and radiated heat long after the fire went low. In heavy storms, these stones became the silent anchors of warmth, keeping the air dry enough for clothes to steam and bodies to rest. Now look up again to that inner liner, the ozone. It wasn't decoration. It was engineering disguised as art. Painted with stories and patterns, it served as the Tipi's invisible engine. The air trapped between the ozone and outer skin acted as insulation, while its slanted edge funneled condensation and leaks down and out. The space above the ozone caught and redirected airflow, keeping the smoke clear even when the rain hammered the outside. It was, in essence, an air curtain system, one that modern architects would recognize instantly. In wetter climates, like the northeastern woodlands, the Iroquois longhouse took a different path to the same goal. Here, the primary material was elm bark, thick, pliable, and waterproof. Harvested in spring, when sap flowed, bark sheets were flattened and dried to the strength of thin wood planks. Builders layered them in a precise overlap pattern, much like shingles, ensuring that each upper layer shed water onto the next. The two-layer system, inner bark laid horizontally, outer bark vertically, locked together like woven fingers, directing water away and blocking wind. Seams and joints were sealed with resin, mixed with powdered charcoal, a natural mastic that stayed flexible in heat and cold. Above the rows of hearths, adjustable roof panels could be shifted with poles to regulate air and keep out rain. The brilliance lay in how the longhouse turned simple materials into a weatherproof structure big enough for dozens of families, warm through the winter and dry through endless rain. Here's the weird part. Even their portable gear followed this same design philosophy. Rain cloaks on the northwest coast were woven from softened cedar bark or grasses. The fibers were layered like the scales of a fish, slanted downward to guide water off in tiny streams. The more it rained, the better they worked. Paired with conical cedar hats, these cloaks acted as wearable roofs, flexible, biodegradable, and self-drying. To keep essential items safe, food, herbs, tinder, they used ingenious waterproof containers. The Plains tribes relied on parfleche, cases made of untanned rawhide, stiff, smooth, and naturally water-resistant. In forest regions, birch bark boxes served the same role, their seams sealed with pine resin that hardened to a glossy, watertight finish. Each design solved the same problem differently: how to keep the inner world dry while the outer world drowned. Even fire itself became a tool of adaptation. When rain made sparks impossible, they carried smoldering embers in tinder fungus or clay pots filled with ash. The embers slept but never died, glowing quietly for hours. Each person carried their own ember pouch, often made of smoked leather and worn close to the body so that warmth and dryness were constant companions. All of these tools, hides, flaps, bark, boxes, embers, were part of a single philosophy of design. Every element worked with the others, guided by wind, rain, and gravity rather than by force. When modern architects talk about passive systems or bioclimatic design, they're describing something indigenous builders mastered long ago. Here's the beauty of it. These tools weren't about domination or innovation for its own sake. They were acts of understanding. Each one said the same quiet truth. The elements don't need to be conquered, they need to be understood. The result was a civilization that could live in the middle of the storm, warm, dry, and at peace. Not because they found a way to shut the world out, but because they built a way to live within it. The storm didn't pause for comfort. It never asked permission. The clouds gathered, the wind turned sharp, and the downpour began its endless drumming. Yet life continued. For native peoples, rain wasn't a disruption. It was part of the rhythm of existence. Their daily behaviors, every small motion, carried the same intelligence as their tools, shaped not by defiance, but by adaptation. Here's the fascinating part. Their mastery wasn't found in isolated inventions. It lived in habits, repeated actions so fluid they looked effortless. How you built a fire, where you placed your bed, how you dried your clothes. Each decision carried the weight of generations. Together, they made survival almost graceful. Setting up camp in the rain started long before the first drop fell. Site selection was both art and instinct. A good hunter could read the ground like a map. He'd look for slight slopes that drained water naturally, avoiding hollows where puddles formed. The soil had to be firm but porous, sandy, never clay, to prevent flooding. The tipi or lodge would be placed where prevailing winds helped smoke rise instead of blow back inside. Rivers provided water, but distance mattered. Too close, and rising floods would drown the camp overnight. Too far, and access became a burden. The perfect site balanced proximity with safety, a principle modern architects would call environmental integration. Here's the smart move. The teepee could be raised or dismantled in less than an hour, even by a small family. Poles were bundled together, hides rolled into a single pack, and the entire structure carried by horse or sled. In storm season, mobility was survival. They could move to higher ground before the deluge, or shift the camp to a sheltered valley when winds turned violent. That flexibility, the ability to move your house, was itself a tool against the weather. When the storm hit, every action inside the teepee became ritual precision. The entrance always faced east, toward the morning sun and away from the harshest winds. The fire burned low but steady in the center pit, ringed by stones that trapped heat. Bedding and clothing hung along the liner walls, where rising warmth and circulating air dried them in hours. Children slept on raised mats or hide platforms to keep them off damp ground. At night, the sound of rain on the outer skin became part of the background, not danger, but lullaby. Here's the catch. They didn't try to stay dry at all times. In long journeys, moccasins would soak through quickly, especially when crossing wet grass or streams. But that wasn't failure. It was expectation. When stopping to rest, travelers would remove their moccasins immediately, stuff them with dry grass, and set them near the fire to dry. The soft smoked leather would regain its shape within half an hour. Grass insoles were replaced daily, a renewable layer that wicked moisture away from the skin. By accepting wetness as part of the cycle, they turned drying into rhythm, not crisis. Travelers carried fire the same way. A small ember, glowing in a bundle of tinder fungus or wrapped in dry bark, was kept inside a leather pouch close to the chest. The body's warmth kept it alive. When it was time to rest, that ember became a flame again. No friction, no flint, just continuity. Even fire was never truly extinguished. It only slept. Harvesting and foraging followed the same logic. After days of rain, they sought food that thrived in the wet: mushrooms, pawpaw fruit, mayhaw berries, persimmons. These weren't random choices. Many of them provided vitamin C, a vital defense against scurvy during long, damp winters. The fruits were boiled or dried, turned into cakes and jellies that lasted months. Pemmican, that dense mix of dried meat, fat, and berries, was stored in parfleche containers to keep out moisture. It could survive the storm as easily as the people who made it. When preparing food or tending fires, They used a layered approach. Dry grass, cattail fluff, and fungus served as tinder. Small twigs and bark went next. Only then came the heavier wood. Everything was organized so that wet logs never touched the flame. Even inside the teepee, small fires could burn for hours without smoke choking the air. The smoke rose in a clean spiral, pulled by the convection currents between the ozone and the outer hide. A living ventilation system in motion. Here's the weird part. They even designed their sleep patterns around weather. During long storms, families rotated shifts tending the fire. One would sleep while another fed the flames, ensuring heat never died. Children learned early that the sound of crackling wood meant safety, and the smell of smoke meant home. In the longhouses of the Iroquois, communal behavior reinforced survival. Dozens of families lived under one curved roof, each with its own hearth aligned along a central corridor. The architecture encouraged cooperation. One person's fire helped warm the next. When the rain grew heavy, everyone worked together to adjust roof panels, seal bark gaps with resin, or reinforce the grass mats on the floor. This shared rhythm turned weather into a collective experience, not an individual struggle. In coastal regions where rain came sideways, woven cedar bark cloaks became everyday armor. People wore them loosely, allowing air to circulate beneath. The cloaks didn't keep every drop out. Instead, they diverted water, letting it slide away before soaking through. When the rain stopped, the cloaks dried in minutes, ready to use again. They weren't garments of defense, but tools of harmony, light, breathing extensions of the environment. Even children participated in these patterns. They were taught how to read the sky, the smell before a storm, the color of distant clouds, the texture of wind. They learned that a sudden hush in the forest meant heavy rain was minutes away. This intuitive weather reading wasn't a skill. It was literacy in the language of the land. Everyday behavior formed a choreography, one step leading to the next in quiet precision. Collect dry grass before the rain. Move the camp to high ground. Hang hides at an angle by the fire. Replace the grass soles in your moccasins. Stir the embers while others sleep. None of it felt extraordinary, but it was a continuous, living science embedded in culture. Here's the beauty. They didn't just survive the storm. They lived through it, singing, cooking, crafting, raising children. Rain was not an interruption, but a condition of life. The hiss of wet wood, the patter on hides, the scent of smoke in the cold, these weren't hardships. They were reminders of belonging, of the ancient contract between people and weather. When you live that close to nature, adaptation becomes identity. Every movement, every gesture is a quiet declaration. We are part of this, not separate from it. And when the rain finally ends and sunlight breaks through, the camp doesn't feel relieved. It feels complete, because surviving the storm wasn't about endurance. It was about harmony. When the last drops faded and the clouds finally began to thin, what remained wasn't exhaustion. It was gratitude. Because for the native peoples who lived within the rhythm of rain, surviving a storm meant more than simply staying alive. It meant proof that harmony worked better than resistance. The benefits of their designs and behaviors reached far beyond comfort. They shaped entire ways of living that were efficient, sustainable, and profoundly intelligent. Here's the quiet truth. Their world ran on less, but delivered more. A single tipi, built from a fraction of the materials used in a settler's log cabin, offered superior climate control. where a wooden cabin needed walls thicker than a man's arm and consumed entire trees for heating. A teepee used perhaps 1/10 the wood and still stayed warmer. Why? Because it breathed. The air circulated constantly, feeding the fire with oxygen while removing dampness and smoke. In measurable terms, it was an energy-efficient house long before that term existed. When it rained for days, that same breathable structure meant survival without rot or mold. The hides dried faster than timber ever could. The movable design meant that when the ground turned to mud or floods threatened, people could simply move, not rebuild. This mobility saved time, labor, and resources. No wasted effort, no scars on the land. The teepee was a closed-loop system, renewable, portable, and endlessly reusable. Here's the smart part. The benefits extended to health. The breathable clothing and quick-drying moccasins kept the body's temperature stable. No trapped sweat meant fewer chills and infections, fewer cases of frostbite in winter, and less fatigue overall. Smoke-tanned hides, rich with natural resins, even repelled insects and slowed bacterial growth. What modern science calls antimicrobial surfaces already existed in every shirt and pair of leggings they wore. Dietary practices complemented this design philosophy. Foraging for moisture-rich fruits like pawpaw, mayhaw, and persimmon wasn't only about taste. It replenished vitamin C and hydration, protecting against scurvy and exhaustion. Pemmican, dried meat mixed with berries and fat, didn't spoil in damp weather, and a small handful provided energy for hours. These food systems minimized dependency on fragile crops or stored goods, creating resilience in fluctuating climates. The environmental benefit was equally profound. Indigenous housing and clothing left no permanent mark. When a teepee was dismantled, no debris was left behind. The poles were reused, the hides repaired or recycled. No deforestation, no scarred landscape. The same rain that soaked their camps nourished the earth again, unpoisoned by waste. Even the ashes from their fires returned to the soil as mineral fertilizer. Modern sustainability experts spend lifetimes chasing this balance. They lived it every day. Here's the overlooked advantage. Community. Living close to one another around a central fire strengthened bonds. In the longhouses of the Iroquois, families shared warmth and labor, which in turn shared energy. The architecture encouraged cooperation. When storms came, people didn't fight alone. They adjusted the roof flaps together, dried hides side by side, tended to each other's fires. In that shared effort, resilience became social as much as physical. Even spiritually, the system brought benefits. By working with the weather instead of fearing it, people cultivated a calm acceptance that shaped their worldview. Rain was not punishment, nor was it an obstacle. It was simply part of the Earth's cycle, a voice of renewal. That attitude reduced anxiety and fostered mental strength. The lesson was simple. When you stop trying to dominate nature, you stop feeling dominated by it. The cumulative effect of all this was a culture that thrived where others struggled. Efficiency without exploitation. Comfort without consumption. Knowledge without arrogance. What looks to us like ancient technology was, in truth, a complete philosophy of design, practical, emotional, and ecological all at once. And perhaps the most surprising benefit of all? Longevity. These methods endured for centuries because they worked. No machinery, no modern materials, just the continuous refinement of an idea that the human body, the home, and the land form one system. Disturb that harmony, and you suffer. Respect it, and you flourish. So when the rain cleared and the first shaft of sunlight touched the wet earth, there was no sense of victory. There was continuity. The fire smoked gently, the hides gleamed, and the people stepped out into the glistening world, dry, calm, and unafraid. Because the greatest benefit of all was not comfort or survival. It was belonging. When the storm finally broke and the sky stretched open, the land shimmered, every blade of grass jeweled with water, every breath sharp with the scent of pine and smoke. The people stepped out quietly, their footsteps soft in the damp earth. There was no celebration, no cheer of triumph. The rain had not been conquered. It had simply passed, as it always did. And that was enough. Here's the truth at the heart of it all. Native peoples didn't just survive the rain. They understood it. They saw water not as an enemy, but as a teacher. Every drop, every flood, every soaked horizon reminded them of a deeper law. Nature does not yield to force. It yields to respect. That single truth, practiced over millennia, built an entire civilization that lived in balance rather than struggle. When you look closely, their inventions weren't just clever. They were philosophical. A smoked hide wasn't only a waterproof material, it was a lesson in transformation, in how fire and air can change matter without destroying it. A tipi wasn't merely a home, it was a living embodiment of balance, the perfect intersection of geometry and spirit, form and function. A birch bark box or a cedar cloak wasn't primitive survival gear. It was a symbol of intelligence rooted in humility. Modern society often calls such knowledge ancient technology, as if it belongs to the past. But the truth is, these ideas are more advanced than most of what we build today. Think about it. Zero waste, fully renewable materials, passive climate control, circular design. Concepts that engineers and designers now treat as cutting-edge sustainability. The indigenous peoples of North America lived them centuries ago. They didn't need laboratories or algorithms. They had something deeper, an unbroken dialogue with the land. Here's the catch. We lost that dialogue. Somewhere along the road to progress, we replaced understanding with control, patience with speed, adaptation with domination. We built walls to shut nature out, only to find ourselves trapped inside them. Our buildings consume energy to do what a teepee did naturally. Our clothes suffocate our skin to keep out the same rain that once nourished every river and seed. We've forgotten what it means to cooperate with the world that built us. But the wisdom is still there, waiting. Every ember of it smolders in the old ways, in the shape of a tipi seen against lightning, in the scent of smoked leather, in the way a fire crackles under wet skies. It lives in languages that describe rain not as bad weather, but as the returning breath of the sky. It survives in the elders who still know how to prepare hides, how to read the clouds, how to listen before acting. The message isn't nostalgia, it's guidance. The same knowledge that kept people warm and dry in endless rain could help us build a sustainable future now. Because climate adaptation isn't a new science, it's a remembered one. The native philosophy of cooperation with the elements is not just heritage, it's the blueprint for resilience in an unstable world. Here's the beautiful paradox. To move forward, we may need to look back, to rediscover a time when survival and reverence were the same act, when rain wasn't a problem to solve, but a relationship to honor, when every design decision, from the tilt of a roof to the seam of a moccasin, reflected a single idea: live lightly, and you will live long. And maybe that's the final lesson of the rain. It falls on everyone equally, the wise and the unwise, the prepared and the careless. But only those who listen to it, who learn from it, find comfort within its sound. The native peoples didn't fight the storm. They joined it, and in doing so, found peace. So as you watch the clouds gather again, remember this: the rain will come. It always does. But the question isn't whether we can stop it. It's whether we can live well beneath it. To honor that way of living is to honor more than history. It's to honor intelligence born of humility, innovation born of observation, and survival born of balance. The people who stayed dry in the endless rain weren't defying nature. They were becoming part of it. Protect indigenous knowledge. Learn from it. Carry it forward. Because in the story of the rain, that knowledge is the shelter. And we, all of us, are still standing beneath the same sky.